Greetings! Hope this video finds you well. Today we are talking about abolition, which was the second in our series of Lent lectures / sermons that we did. I preached this many weeks ago, but I'm trying to recreate it because there was some requests that I upload all of the Lenten series lectures online because some people may have missed them, as many of them were done as the early days of March. So this one, for abolition, I am doing the texts Genesis 1, 26 through 27, and Psalm 8. So Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and then let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all wild animals of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. Or in Psalm 8, "O God, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth." Amen. So the abolition movement. The abolition movement officially took off in 1830 with the publication of The Liberator, which was done by William Lloyd Garrison. But as you probably know or would think, its roots go back further. When you go back to John Wesley, who we talked about on the Great Awakening, he was a huge advocate of abolition and freedom of human rights and anti-slavery back in the 18th century. Anabaptists were always very anti-slavery. And in the North, it had been abolished by the 1820s, which a lot of people think was maybe sooner, but that was when it first was abolished. But you still kind of see it happening even up to the Civil War, kind of being tolerated in the North. But when William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, it kind of sparked off this movement. There was a lot of growing angst against this idea of slavery. There was more and more free African Americans around, and people were starting to, especially in the North, see how absurd this practice was, even though it was still a relatively small percentage of population. Most people just wanted to ignore it. But once The Liberator was published, not long after that, in 1831, Nat Turner had his slave revolt, which resulted in the death of 55 white people. Now, who knows how many black people were killed? They didn't really keep count of that in the South at the time, but that freaked out a lot of Southern slave owners because they felt, whether it was true or not, that this happened as a direct result of the publication of The Liberator. And so it actually caused many Southern slave people to want to be openly vocal against The Liberator and to clamp down harder on the control of slaves and make laws even more restrictive towards slaves. So, which even inflamed abolitionists even further. Now, one of the things that also helped in Lloyd Garrison's movement is that he started not only the paper, but he started these anti-slavery groups all over the North. And there was some dissension within them. There was different ones that had different motives and different ideas. There was people who believed that they wanted to end slavery, but then they didn't want to integrate black and white people together. There was an idea that did not go away after the Civil War. There was those who were very focused on slavery, but they were still very demeaning towards women, which alienated a lot of people. If you're fighting for one group's rights, why not this other group? But William Lloyd Garrison would hold and stay as all human rights. That the anti-slavery movement was about all human rights. And one of his biggest helpers in this would be Frederick Douglass, who would escape from slavery in 1838 and would come to some of the meetings of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison would convince him to start talking about his experiences as a slave growing up, and he would soon find out that Frederick Douglass was a powerful speaker, and he would actually begin to eclipse William Lloyd Garrison as the focal point of the movement, and this would actually result in some animosity between the two of them, because when you got these two people that are both kind of thinking that one started it and one was the protege who ends up surpassing the teacher, so they'd end up kind of actually having a rivalry with each other in later years of the abolition movement, especially after 1845 when Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, which many people thought was ghostwritten by a white person, and because nobody thought that, a black person can't write that well, but it was Frederick Douglass. Guess what? Black people and white people can write just as bad and just as good as each other. We're all human. Another big thing that happened during this time was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was proof that even as word was spreading about anti-slavery and sentiment was turning towards William Lloyd Garrison in the North and this idea that, yes, maybe we should honor human rights for everybody. I know, bizarre concept. But down south, they were digging in their heels. These slave owners and a lot of people down there were like, you know what? Nobody's going to tell us how to live. And we're going to do what we want to do. And so they started this Fugitive Slave Act, which basically made it so that even if a slave escaped to freedom to the north, northern policemen and officials were required to return that slave back down south. And this was a huge blow to the abolition movement, who had assisted in freeing so many slaves, especially through the work of Harriet Tubman, who would do 13 trips down south to pick up slaves and bring them back. She herself being an escaped slave, she would end up saving 70 slaves through the Underground Railroad. And when this Fugitive Slave Act happens, they would have to take these people all the way to Canada, because just getting to the north was not good enough. You were still possibly the victim of being forced to go back down south. A good representation of this act and its consequences was like the movie 12 Years a Slave that came out a couple years ago. It's basically, we have this idea that basically, if you were a black person living in America, you had to have proof that you were free on you at all times, or else no matter who you were, you could be faced going back into slavery down south. And it didn't matter whether you were free or not. They put it really on the black person to prove themselves rather than on the person catching them to prove that they were owned by somebody. It's nothing that ever happens anymore, is it? No. And so this, and it also, there's increased violence, increased restrictions on slaves during this time. It really became really terrible to be. It was always terrible to be a slave in the South, but this period of time made it really bad. It was, if you thought that the slave owners were mean and horrible to their slaves beforehand, well, now they just went full on. And it really started causing tensions to mount within the abolition movement. There was those who, like William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted to continue this nonviolent protests and action for the abolition. And then you had people like Frederick Douglass who were increasingly like, no, we need to go in there with guns and we need to force them to stop. And there was someone who really caught on to Frederick Douglass's words, and his name was John Brown. Now, John Brown is a fire and brimstone guy. John Brown was very much black and white. What is right? What is wrong? If something's wrong, we need to do everything within our power to make sure it's right. And he wasn't afraid of using violence to appease his needs. And he had an idea. In Harper's Ferry, Virginia, there was an armory. Get down there, take over the armory, make a call out to all the slaves in the surrounding area, get them to escape, then come to that armory, arm themselves, and just start shooting everybody that tries to oppose them. Well, he took this idea to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass thought it was a little crazy, did not back him on it, but like I said, Frederick Douglass wasn't necessarily against the idea. So on October 16th, 1859, John Brown did this. What's very ironic about the entire situation is that the first person that would be killed in the resulting skirmish would be a slave. After John Brown and his men got off the train in Harper's Ferry, a slave saw them and rushed off to go tell his master what was going on, and they shot him. So here they come to free slaves, and the first person that ends up dying is a slave. They do get a hold of the armory. People weren't really ready for this. But very soon after he takes control of the armory, Robert E. Lee is dispatched with his Virginia militia to come and to control the situation. And unfortunately for John Brown, his hope that there would just be slaves coming from all over the land to join him didn't happen. And so he quickly lost. He was quickly captured and would end up being hung. Now, what's kind of ironic is that this would be probably the catalyst movement to spark off the Civil War. This scene of violence would start up that debate again. And it helped that in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had this very human depiction of what slavery was like in the U.S. And over the years, it not only was a best-selling novel, but had become a play. So the people that didn't read saw the play and became a national phenomenon. So by the time that John Brown did this, there was this national movement to end slavery. So even though he was unsuccessful it would be successful in sparking the violence that he desired. And it would be a very unfortunate war, because it would be the most blood spilled on American soil over the next 5 years. So now with churches during this time, this is where it gets kind of sad. No church really stood up in unity against slavery. Northern churches supported abolition movements. Southern churches supported slavery. There was very few denominations that were unified against slavery. And when you think about the message of Christ, it really comes home in how sad that was, and how deeply the church failed African Americans at this time and in times to come. I wish I could say that as a Lutheran, all Lutherans rallied in the abolition movement, but they didn't. The Frankian Synod of the Lutheran Church was actually founded in the 1840s as a result of the National Lutheran Church unwilling to take a stand on this. And the Frankian Synod would become the abolitionist branch of the Lutheran Church. And it would be considered for a long time to be a radical arm of the Lutheran Church. So it's really sad, because the church failed in what it's supposed to do in fighting for human rights in the world. And instead, as so many times in history, it just fought for the status quo. Like, we don't want any disruption. Let's just keep things the way they are. The people that come to our churches are fine, so we're just going to do what we want to do. And what's even sadder is that, and with this war and with the South digging in, is that slavery was on its way out. The cotton gin was on its way in. So what the South was primarily using slaves for was no longer going to be relevant in several years. And while they're digging their heels in, it was inevitable that the enterprise was going to be done. So if they had just let it go, they would have been just fine. And we wouldn't have had all of the resulting issues that came out of the Civil War, all the deaths, all the just the terrible things that happened. But instead, as it is with so many times in human history, there's so many people are like, we will not change. This is the way we are. This is what we're going to do, and we don't care. And it ended up causing more problems than it solves. The roots of the abolition movement and human fights for human dignity, at least here in America, is the realization that America was founded by the collision of three peoples. You had the natives that were already here, you had the Europeans that volunteered to come here, and then you had the forced migration of African Americans, or Africans that would become African Americans. And if we were going to truly fight for equal rights, we have to recognize who each of these peoples are. And here in the abolition movement is that recognition of at least one was put in a subservient position, and that need to put them on a more equal footing with everybody else, to stop denying them their basic human rights, and realize that they are part of this world just like the white people. It seems so clear to us today, but that was something that people really had to wrestle with back then. And it still wasn't complete because, as we know, there was still Native rights, there's still women's rights that are going on at the same time that aren't being respected either. And when we look at the gospel, when we look at these passages from Genesis and this passage from Psalm 8, it's this idea that all human beings are God's children. And that recognizing within each and every one of us that each and every one of us is God's child. And that when you are putting somebody in a lower position than yourselves, then you're putting one of God's children, one of your brothers or sisters, into a lower position than yourself, forcing them to become subservient to you, treating somebody as lesser, which is one of the biggest problems in this world, is treating some lives as being less valuable than other lives. And that is the root of the abolition movement, is that recognizing that all lives should be equal. Amen.